Friday night, so I was like,
Yeah.
be ready.
Yes, exactly.
It was not so much, very much wind to my left. It was just the wind that was really.
Oh yeah. Yeah. We need to go a couple places there. Part of her tree behind his house. In his house. 2 foot diameter. So we had to patch that out and we were yesterday trying to get it repaired. Not repaired, but I have a brother-in-law and he was going to take care of the repairs because we're going to be leaving today. And so I know we're going to be able to. So we went over there and took care of that tree. Clearly was a big part of it. They came down, hit the house, and then landed this one. Like it was almost like it, ricochet sort of.
The damage is substantial.
Yeah.
I don't think I've seen anything like this. I did okay. Usually Sunday mornings I can struggle with. I did okay this morning.
Good for you.
I didn't get as much sleep as I wanted.
Yeah. She woke up at 5 and has been sleeping since. So.
Yeah. It can be rough.
No, you're not an early morning.
Where are you going to go?
No, but I was out in Cloverdale or at the wedding reception. There's a lot of trees down there. Nothing really out there. I hear you're taking pictures and people used to Nashville. They're the same.
Good morning. It's about time to get started. Yeah. Sit down and be quiet. Get in your places with happy, shining faces. Don't make me sing the song. Okay, I think some folks are still going to filter in, but we can go ahead and kind of get started, at least with a review. So we're trying to hopefully change kind of our paradigm on conflict and change it to a biblical paradigm. So what would you say is the maybe different outlook we would have on conflict?
It's an opportunity.
Good. Conflict is an opportunity.
An opportunity to glorify God.
And specifically an opportunity to glorify God. Good. And where would we go to kind of support our claim that we need to glorify God in conflict?
1 Corinthians 10.
That's it.
30 something.
31. Good. Right? 1 Corinthians 10:31. And what does 1 Corinthians 10:31 say? Someone who hasn't spoken up, Alan? whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Good. So then, part of glorifying God, the next objective that we have that would glorify God in conflict is what?
Know our own shortcomings by getting the log out of our own eye.
Good. Get the log out of our own eye. See our shortcomings. So when there's conflict, that could be completely because the other person is just despicable. Or it could be that we are a little bit despicable in this situation as well, right? So, and in just about every conflict, it's not completely one-sided. And a Christian goes into conflict, or should go into conflict, with the mindset of, what does God want me to learn that will make me more like his son? Right? What we're going to find out in the next chapter, my favorite chapter in the book, is conflict is going to reveal the idols in our heart. Okay? If we let it. If we let it. So, we want to make sure that we go into conflict and that when we're in conflict, we change our mindset and think, okay, how did I contribute to this? And could my contribution to this conflict actually be something that I need to change about myself?
And one of the really things is we just have to learn to listen. We're terrible listeners. And by habit, we don't. And we're not listening. We're not going to be able to solve the problem the way God wants us to because we don't understand the whole picture.
Excellent, yeah. We usually are busier trying to think of how we're going to respond to someone's comment than we are making sure we fully understand their comment and seeking to see if there's something about me that is really annoying that I need to change. And here comes the other half of the congregation right there.
Brad.
Yes. Yes. 1 Corinthians 10:31. Do what? Hebrews?
1 Corinthians 10:31 is the glorify God.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Good. Yeah. And conflict there is, do I eat? What do I eat? Clean or unclean foods? Do I eat meat sacrificed to idols? Right? Alan?
To Mike's point too, when you already have a negative thought against not necessarily always the person, but what they've said or what they've done, you tend to boil, and then you tend to not want to listen to them because you're already just so frustrated. So lending yourself to actually, before you even have any discussion with them, you need to calm down because a lot of times you're not going to be receptive to listening.
Very true. Yep. Yeah, it's good to and there are times, I don't know if you guys do this, but there are times when like somebody does something or emails something out and it's like totally wrong and obviously accusing me of not doing my job, or like being really, really lazy and not wanting to do their job, which makes everyone else's job harder. And like, I will type up an email and I'll be like, nope, I shouldn't send this. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to walk away. I'm going to take a walk, stroll around the building. I'm going to think about this. I'm going to pray about it and go, all right, Lord, this person is an idiot. How do I respond to glorify you? I think the only thing that will glorify you is this person is humiliated by me. That seems like the best thing that can happen here. But we know that's not really the answer. So, you got to walk away. So yeah, sometimes we need to calm down, pray about it, and then start to reform those pathways in our brain so that when there is conflict and somebody installs a bunch of plants in the completely the wrong places, and you have to redo it, right, Tim? So what am I going to do? How do I glorify God in this? So reform those pathways. So we talked about last time there are several things that we shouldn't do. We shouldn't just pretend the conflict doesn't exist, and we shouldn't just bowl over people. Instead, there are some tools in our tool belt biblically that we can use to glorify God in conflict. One of them that we've been focusing on in this chapter is overlooking an offense. It is to a man's glory to overlook an offense. We don't have to take every single thing that people do and take it to make it into a mountain of conflict. We can choose to flatten it out ourselves and smooth it over without anything, without having to disrupt anybody, especially if sometimes that's what we ought to do. And we'll get into some of that in a bit. Yeah, Mike?
I remember a long time ago, and I probably one of the public speakers I heard speak, upset about something, you're mad about something, and I use it at work with some of my employees. Is this something that you're really gonna think about, remember, and be upset about next week, next month? People have a real problem looking at the big picture, and they're so bent on looking at the small picture, it doesn't matter. They miss what's really important.
Right, yep. That's a good point, yeah. So in a month, are you going to be remembering this, right? Now, if you're like, yes, because they're going to do it over and over and over and over and make everyone else's life miserable, then okay, I need to gently restore, right? Actually, I've got an employee right now that will do whatever it takes to make sure they don't have to do extra work. So, like, they will make everybody else work twice as hard if they don't have to, just so they don't have to do their work, right? So yeah, it's very frustrating, and then they don't really understand what they're doing. But anyway, I'm airing grievances here now. One of the things that we should do is overlook, and Ephesians 4, after laying out all God's provisions for us, he says, as a prisoner of the Lord, verse 1, I urge you to live in a manner worthy of the calling to which you've been called, or which you have received. And then he says, be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. So, one of the main things that we should do when we're thinking, how do I live up to these spiritual blessings that God has poured out on me? Be humble, be gentle. That's number one, with each other, right? So, be ready to overlook an offense. And so, when we're thinking about overlooking an offense, one thing that we can do to help us to maybe put offenses in perspective was Philippians 4, right? Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. To be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, take your requests to God, right? And whatever is good, true, noble about that person, if there's somebody you cannot get along with, then I need to do this at work right now. I need to list out all of the good things that person is doing, so that I don't just focus on the 1 or 2 or 5 irritating things that's happening right now, right? So we talked about that. We spent a lot of time on that. Another thing, and I'm going to pick up on page 90, in order to help us overlook offenses, it's good to count the cost of the conflict. Count the cost of the conflict. So let's go to Matthew 5. And we're going to pick up in about verse 23, I think. Yeah. So we're going to get to this this is the last principle here in verse 23. But if I could have someone read 23 through 26 of Matthew 5. Yeah, Tim, go ahead.
Therefore, if you are offering a gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge. And the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny.
Okay, so somebody summarize that in your own words. What are those scriptures saying? Yeah.
Relationships are more important than stuff.
Relationships are more important than stuff. Great summary. Jesse?
This is probably also where Paul arrived at, as much as within you lies, trying to make peace with all.
Right, good. As long as it depends on you, live at peace with all men. Good.
Don't let it linger.
Don't let it linger. Good. Any other observations from the text?
It's good to have some input on the terms that are going to come about instead of handing it to a judge to make like a declaration. You're typically better off to figure it out between the two of you or whoever.
Right, okay. So let me pick up on that. So you're better off to figure it out between yourselves than to go before a judge, right? Do you see that? Settle matters quickly. Do it while you're still together, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge hand you over to the officer, and you will be thrown into prison, and you will not get out until you paid the last penny. So, what's the cost there, Jesse?
It reminds me of a stand-up comic talking about going through litigation, and they had gotten emails where he was clearly just trying to be sarcastic. But once you get to that level of litigation, they're going to scrutinize every aspect of the situation. So I think this is really, obviously, it's wise advice to try to avoid all of that.
Right, good, yeah. Yeah, once you get to court, you are no longer trying to amicably work things out. The lawyers themselves are going to do everything they can to make you look like the enemy and your opponent look like a saint, because that's their job. If they can do that, then the judge will find in their favor, right? Yeah.
Samuel tells Saul that to obey is better than to sacrifice, and here we see that reconciliation is better than sacrifice.
Good,
More
right?
important. It needs to come first.
Yeah. Good. It's interesting how those Old Testament principles are still applicable, still shining through, and Jesus just brings them forward. Okay, so on page 90 and 91, was there anything that you highlighted or you want to point out from that text?
You kind of already talked about it, but like the emotional and like spiritual exhaustion that it causes. Like Don and I have actually been in a lawsuit before, and I remember it was all we talked about.
Yeah.
And then when it was over, we were like, I specifically remember, what are we going to talk about now? Like it consumes your life. You don't
Right. Yes. Yeah. Right. So that probably is similar, your circumstance, probably similar to this story on page 91. Did anybody get a chance to read that story and would like to summarize what happened there in that conflict, the business conflict? Yeah, April.
You had a small group of Christians and one non-Christian in business together. They're trying to divide things up, and the non-Christian wanted more. The Christians were like, no, that's not what you deserve. And they fought it and caught up in it, they didn't stop and look at the big picture or the end goal.
Good, yeah. And when you say they were so caught up in it, what does that mean? What does that sound like when they were saying that?
Their brains were on me, us. This is what I deserve, this is mine. You can't have what's mine.
Good, yeah. Yeah. And I thought it was interesting when the author met with those three men and asked them why they wouldn't settle. This is second paragraph on page 91. At the end, it says, they said, it isn't just the money, it's the principle of the matter. Right? How many times have you said that? Look, I don't really care that much about the money. It's just that what he's asking for is not fair. Right? So then he says, okay, how much is the principle of the matter costing you? Right? How much time has already been taken away from your business? And how much more time will a lawsuit cost you? And time will that consume? And so some guy, one of the partners, pulls out his calculator and adds it up and says, all right, we probably spent $5,000 worth of my time just until date. And if we go into a lawsuit, it'll be 10 times that. So the amount that he's asking for is put into perspective, right? Okay, so that's like a story from really big numbers. How does that apply on a smaller scale like daily?
The intangibles are the ones we really have a difficult time counting the cost. What's it do with their stress? What's it do with actually pulling us away from God while we're going through this thing? And those are things that we don't think about. But it really is important that we understand that.
Good. Jesse?
I have this very quick story. My dad is obviously retired, but he still does a lot of side jobs. And whenever he's dealing with these people, he's always very giving from a business perspective. And as a son, I'm like, Dad, you need to demand more. You need to, like, you're worth more than this and that kind of thing. And in my mind, I'm telling myself, Dad, this is not how you get rich or successful. That's the idol, I think, that I'm realizing. And what he's trying to do is make an honest, good relationship with another individual while still being paid for his time. And it's like, my drive is like, you should be demanding more. You should be getting more. It's not even my endeavor, but I see that as like wanting more and more and more. And I think that's exposing kind of what you alluded to, an idol.
Yep. Good. Yep. Yeah, Jen.
In the book Unoffendable, the writer goes through, he's on the radio, so he's a radio personality, and he also had a blog, and he was talking about this really mean comment that he had, and he went through two scenarios. So like, he forgets the comment, he just lets it go, and he has like a peaceful evening with his family, or he spits back a really great angry response, and then he thinks about it all night long, and then he doesn't sleep well. I don't remember the whole story, but it's like this whole thing.
And
that,
keeps
like,
refreshing Facebook to see if anybody has liked his comment or posted.
Reading new comments, and it's just so, how often do we do that, where we could just let it go, even though it's so not natural, but then the peace that comes with that is just huge, and that could happen daily if you're interacting with people daily, but that, so I thought that was a really good example of like, I can use that example.
Yep, for sure. Yep. Yeah.
To go along with that, I had underlined at the bottom of 90 and beginning of 91, the passage that's there in Psalm 73, 21 and 22. This hit me. When my heart was embittered and I was pierced within, then I was senseless and ignorant. I was like a beast before you.
Guilty. Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
I was senseless and ignorant. Like, how many times have we let somebody else's offensive or hurtful comment or whatever totally ruin our day or our week, right? Now, is it worth the cost? We need to count that cost, right? And it might be like, you know what? I don't have to think about that. Now, it takes discipline of the mind to not dwell on it. But the more you practice it, the stronger you become at, you know what, I'm not gonna let that. And some, I will say, there are varying degrees, right, of being triggered. Some people are triggered at the slightest offense. And some people, you can lob grenades at them and they're like, not triggered. I'm okay, right? So there's definitely a muscle, if you will, of or a level of callousness to where you choose what you should be offended at. Okay, so what about? Okay, so it sounds to me like what we're saying so far is we just need to let everything go, let people walk all over us, and just right. That's what we should do. No, of course not. So he goes into this, what about rights? Okay, page 92, really through like the end of the chapter, is this idea of, well, what about rights? Whenever I hear, okay, some people say, I have my rights, it wouldn't be just to let him off so easily, right? Because we do have this justice gland. We want what's right. We want what's fair. That's not fair that that happens, right? So what is his response to that, though?
Be merciful as your Father is merciful.
Right? And how has the Father been merciful?
Well, and where would we be if he treated us criminally like that?
Right. Where would you spend eternity if God administered justice that was not tempered with mercy? Right? So we have to realize, okay, I don't want what's fair because I'm not getting what's fair from God. What's fair is for me to spend eternity in condemnation. But instead, we should be merciful as our Father has been merciful to us. And then there was a quote by Antonin Scalia, Justice Scalia, and he makes this point. This is the middle page 92. What is lawful is not always right. Confusing the two concepts is particularly easy for the English speaking because we use the word right to refer both to legality and to moral appropriateness. We say, I have a right to plead the Fifth Amendment, and then refuse to answer questions about possible criminal activity, even when the consequences of exercising that right may cause an innocent person to be convicted. Exercising such a right would certainly be wrong. So, what stood out to you in that comment?
It comes down to the way we look at it, that it's not about justice. If I can get my first thought to be about God, I'm going to be able to better see which direction I need to go. Do I need to let this go? Do I need to reach out for help to, make things right? But we have to take, for lack of a better way, these words and stop applying so much meaning to because they're overused at this point. We have so many words in the English language that are overused. But if stop. And this isn't, I mean, she's not even coming from not even coming from a godly perspective, just simply speaking morally. But when we put that godly in, even more so leading us, helping us have better discernment over when we need to fight for our rights.
Yep, good. The thing that jumps out, that comes to my mind because of what we've been reading lately is the story of Les Mis. Is it anybody familiar with the story of Les Mis? Yeah. Remember, Javert is trying to chase down Jean Valjean because he violated parole and technically should go be arrested and put back in prison. And he's kind of been in hiding, but he's established this new life. And he thinks maybe he is going to be okay, and then Javert catches up to him. And just at the moment he thinks he's about to be arrested, Javert says, you know, I was pretty convinced you were Jean Valjean, but we just so happened arrested the real Jean Valjean, and he's going to be put back in prison. And so Jean Valjean is standing there like, okay, looks like I got off. They think they arrested me. And now I'll be able to live easily because they'll stop looking for me now because they think they have me. But then God starts working on his heart, and he's convinced he can't plead the fifth, right? He has, if he is silent, what's the, what does he say? If I...
I'm silent, I'm condemned. No, if I stay silent, I'm damned.
Yeah. If I speak, I'm condemned. If I'm silent, I'm damned. Right? So he realizes the greater responsibility is his soul. And so he goes and says, that's not Jean Valjean. I'm Jean Valjean. So you should be arresting me, not him. Thought it was interesting. Well, let me just ask you. So in these pages, starting in page 92 and following, what did you highlight? What stood out to you? There's some really powerful ideas in this chapter. Yeah, Jen.
Let's see, it's page 92, that God may call you to give up a right that would be morally and legally justified. I think that's something good to have in my mind because emotions are so unreliable and they can be based on prior hurts that have nothing to do with the present hurt, the old pain and the new pain. And so I love that. Maybe just being ready to give up the right, which is not natural.
Right.
Work in progress, but that's good to think about.
Yeah. Good.
I loved the whole paragraph of people that gave up their rights.
Yes.
A lot of these stories, I don't think about the fact they gave up their rights. We read about these godly people and they're just living their godly lives and actually stopping and studying that they gave it up.
Yeah.
Life and what then came of it because they gave it up.
Yep. Abraham gave up his right and said, hey, Lot, you can choose which land you want. Joseph had every right to, execute his sons for selling him into slavery, or his brothers for selling him into slavery, but he didn't. David, that's a really cool story between him and Shimei. Remember, Shimei's throwing rocks at David, and David overlooks, the king overlooks that, and then when he comes back, Shimei is utterly humiliated for his actions, and David says, spared, right? Paul said, I don't have to have financial support. He had the right, like don't muzzle an ox, right? But he didn't exercise that right always. And of course, Jesus could have called 10,000 angels. He had every right to do that and destroy all these wicked people. He had every right, but he didn't. Yeah,
What about Joseph?
yeah,
Joseph gave up his right over and over and over throughout his life.
right.
He was treated unfairly many, many times, but he never exercised his right. And it was the will of God that he moved forward to become what he became.
Yeah,
Because if he would have exercised his right, then getting to that point of where he needed to be would not have happened. And so, you know, the idea of turning your cheek over and over,
right.
Joseph did it
Yes, that's right.
many times.
It makes me think of the word retaliation. Are we looking to reconcile? Are we looking to correct and help someone, which we get into further? Or are we retaliating because we were hurt?
Right, yeah. Yeah. Steve?
I think in the middle of 95, Brad told me a powerful statement to me about exercising or laying down the right of God's kingdom in mind. All these people drew attention to the goodness and power of God, brought him praise, expanded the ultimate outreach of the gospel, sought the good of others. This should be our goal as well. And I think probably in everything we're saying, if we would just remember our purpose in life is to exalt God.
Yes.
So we need to weigh whether our rights are going to enhance or is it going to hurt the outreach of God.
Yes.
That's the key point I take from all of this.
Yeah, exactly. The question's on page 94. Will exercising my right honor God by showing the gospel in my life? Will exercising my rights advance God's kingdom, or will it advance only my interest at the expense of his kingdom? Will exercising my rights benefit others? Is exercising my rights essential for my own well-being? Right? So, at the bottom of page 93, after he mentions all these people that gave up their rights, he says it's sometimes appropriate to exercise our rights, to talk with others about their wrongs and hold them accountable. So the same Paul that didn't exercise some of his rights was flogged in Philippi. Then he asserts his right and says, I want a trial. I'm a Roman. So then he asserts his rights when he sees or perceives that he needs to, and that would benefit the kingdom the most. So there are times when we can answer these questions on page 94 of, will exercising my right glorify God? It might. The answer to that might be yes. Just because a lot of the time we need to put our rights in check because they're usually self-motivated, self-aggrandizing. Sometimes they're not, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think there on 94, right before the questions you read, I think it's powerful. Rights are not something you deserve and possess for your own benefit.
Yes.
Rather, they are privileges given to you by God, and he wants you to use them for his glory and to benefit others. I think that kind of helps set it in our minds a little better. It's not necessarily right, it's a privilege.
Yes. Even the rights you have are from God, extended to you through the government, right? Remember, God sets up governments and allows them to be. So if there's a right that your government gives you, God gave it to you. See?
Think over in Acts, the 4th chapter, where the name of Jesus was forbidden. Peter and John, I think, make a statement that really registers with me when it talks about rights, standing up or relinquishing. When they said, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than God, you judges, or we cannot but speak the things that we have seen and heard. And I think that's a great example of us saying, okay, you may have the right to forbid that, but we can't help but speak about what we've seen, what we've heard about God, what we believe about God.
Yeah, great example of someone exercising their right and it glorifying God. Not because they really wanted to do this, because the ought trumped. Like, I ought to obey my government, but not as much as I ought to obey God. So I have to speak. If you need to kill me, then so be it. But I ought not be silent. That ought trumps.
When we take out right and put privileges from God, if we can't look at this and put God's name with it, then we should walk away from it.
Yes.
That.
Yep. So at the end, so we talked about 1 Corinthians 10:31. Whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Well, let's finish that and see what it says. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even as I try to please everybody in every way, for I'm not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. That's what he means when he says, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do it to the glory of God. Because Paul's not seeking his own good, but the good of others, the good of many, that they may be saved. Right? Alan?
This whole concept of rights versus privileges and the idea of this being a part of stewardship was like, oh, okay. I've never thought of it in that way, but it really is, because how are we going to benefit God's work if we're not looking at it in this perspective, right?
Yes. Yeah, we have to change our paradigm and the way that we normally think. And it's not easy, because tomorrow morning you'll get up and somebody will do or say something, cut you off in traffic, and you'll immediately react the way you always have, unless you dwell on these ideas, and then maybe God might say, hey, is that glorifying God? Oh, no. Yeah, see.
Question I have, Brad, when I was
Yeah.
going through all this is, my rights versus God's rights. Do I have the right to limit God's rights?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I look at that and say, my rights I need to humble myself for. Do I humble God's rights and not stand up for his rights? That's just maybe that's a dumb question, but it's a question
No,
that goes in my mind quite a bit about, because I think about the conflicts that God's people had in the Old Testament, and even in our apostles and how they died. And it seems like God's rights should not be minimized, or whatever.
Minimized, yeah.
Minimized, yeah. I got a bad neck, and it's affecting my brain. Anything's affecting my brain. But
Maybe my neck is bad too.
I look at that and say, I need to really understand my role is not to minimize God's rights, but to minimize my rights, not hindering God's rights.
Correct. Minimize my rights to maximize God's effectiveness, right? Through me,
Yes.
right? And that's what this is like. Normally, we're not thinking kingdom wide. We're thinking my life right now. I just was hurt by this, so I demand justice. I want what's right. Well, okay, but even bigger is God's right to be glorified.
Doesn't God say vengeance is his? I mean,
Right.
all of this is, to me, all this is very easy, and the Bible has taught us that living this, when
Amen.
vengeance is right with God, it's not my vengeance to take, and limiting my rights to maximize God's kingdom and getting the lost to understand, look at me, I look like Christ.
Right.
So Paul basically saying it here, look at me, I look like Christ. I look like
Yes.
God.
Yeah.
In our actions, not in our appearance. But I
Yes.
look at that and say, to me, that's the powerful thing that comes out of what we're talking about.
Yeah, very good. He talks about on page 96, just as seed must be sacrificed to produce a crop, our personal rights and material assets must sometimes be surrendered to sow the gospel and produce a spiritual harvest, right? So I might have to surrender my right, sacrifice it, put it in the ground, and let it grow and bear fruit for God's kingdom, right? Okay, so there's an awesome story on page 96 to 98 with Ted and Joan. Joan was Ted's supervisor. She didn't like him. He didn't like her. They didn't get along. He had a bad back, and she decided, because they weren't getting along, I'm gonna ask him to do all the hard jobs. And then he injures his back after this, and so now he's on workers' comp, and he decides he's going to sue the company because he could prove she was targeting him with all the hard jobs when she knew he was not as able, right? So in the end, like, he's counseled, and he decides that you need to read this story. It's beautiful. He decides, you know what? I'm going to give up this lawsuit, and instead he cancels the lawsuit and goes and talks to Joan, and he says, you know what? I was not a good employee. And he owns his portion of the conflict, his contribution to the conflict. And then 3 years later, he asked Ted whether he regretted that decision, and because he even rejected the $5,000 they offered to settle the case. He said, no, that was the best $5,000 I ever spent. God used those events to bring several people to Christ because of his witness. Because he went in and said, I messed up. And I didn't point out the Joan's faults. He said, I messed up. So it's a powerful story, but sometimes our rights need to be sacrificed for the good of the kingdom. So we will pick up in chapter 5 next time. Conflict starts in the heart, and we'll go over some idolatry, and that's a really powerful chapter. I'll try and send out a reminder for next Sunday morning, and then maybe some thought questions. Thank you for your input.
Good. Good.